Okay, welcome everyone to the Arizona Native Plant Society meeting for June. Once again, we wish that we could be doing this in person, but of course we're stuck at our houses, so we appreciate you taking some time out of your Tuesday afternoon and joining us. My name is Kirsten Ullman Phillips, and I am the Botany Collections Manager at the Museum of Northern Arizona, and I'm the acting president for the Flagstaff chapter of the Arizona Native Plant Society. We have three presenters tonight. We have Dr. Barbara Phillips is a research associate at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Sheila Murray is a research botanist at the Arboretum at Flagstaff. And Jan Busco is a botany research specialist at the Museum of Northern Arizona. And they're going to be talking to you today about the Invasive Plants Ranger Program. So in 2019, the museum fire has left large areas of disturbed land that are highly vulnerable to weed invasion. Now is the time to be vigilant to prevent weeds from spreading further into our community. So learn about the project and how you can register for a neighborhood workshop. So I'm going to hand it over to, I think Sheila's going to be sharing her screen.
Yes. So, yes, good evening, everybody. I am Sheila Murray, and I'm from the Arboretum at Flagstaff. My co-hosts are Barb Phillips and Jan Busco from the Museum of Northern Arizona. Just another reminder that we are recording this tonight. That's why we turned off all your microphones and your video. However, we are going to turn everybody's connections back on again after the presentation when we have a question and answer session. So tonight, this is just a general introductory overview of our project that we have. And then these are the 5 topics that we are going to be discussing tonight. When we have future training workshops set up after this evening's program, we're going to talk about setting up future training workshops with people who are interested in learning to do invasive species removal and surveys in their neighborhoods more in depth. And we'll go over these items in much more detail during those workshops. But tonight, this is just a general overview. Our project is titled Invasive Plants Ranger Program, Post-Museum Fire Treatment of Invasive Plants. The funding is provided by the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. And this is a collaborative 2-year project that's hopefully will engage citizens and the project partners in monitoring and managing Flagstaff's invasive weeds. Our partners include the Arboretum at Flagstaff, the Museum of Northern Arizona, Natural Channel Design, and the City of Flagstaff. And just a reminder of the importance of controlling invasive species. We often just kind of assume that everybody already knows why we should care about weeds, but we thought we should highlight exactly why these are important to consider. Invasive species are known to displace native species. They can decrease property value. They can decrease recreational value, increase wildfire danger, and also increase erosion. And then also just a quick summary of the terminology that we're going to be using tonight. Sometimes we're going to say weeds, sometimes we say invasive species. We just want you to know that this project in particular is targeting primarily non-native and invasive species. But sometimes we will just call those weeds for the purposes of brevity. So there's 2 main objectives to this project. First, we want to find large areas of weeds on public and private lands and treat them with herbicide and/or ACE hand pulling crews. And then secondly, we would like to engage the public with trainings such as this webinar to find smaller areas of weeds and help neighbors with site visits and guidance on organizing their own neighborhood weed pools. The project area is encompassed by the blue line here. This outline of most of Flagstaff. It's south of the museum fire, which is this area up here. The museum fire happened in 2019, as we all know, and it's left major areas of disturbed land that are definitely vulnerable to weed invasion. So the goals of this project are to remove existing weeds from the area, prevent weed spread, and to revegetate disturbed sites on all sorts of land types. So we want to do it on private land, city land, and county lands. The project area is 5,200 acres. So it's a pretty large project boundary. This work is also going to support previous work that has been done already by the U.S. Forest Service on treating and spraying for weeds. So we will be focused mainly in this project area on 3 drainages, Schultz Creek, Spruce Canyon, and Spruce Avenue Wash. And all of these drainages end up draining down into the Rio de Flag. So, you know, hopefully treatments will reduce that transport of invasive plant seeds from any stuff from the north. Tonight, we're encouraging you to help us by learning about invasive species, which you'll be doing tonight, perhaps by surveying your neighborhoods and yards, and also to learn how to treat these areas by pulling the weeds and restoring the landscape. We greatly appreciate your time tonight, and also any time in the future. So if you do decide to continue on with us in a volunteer capacity with this project, we'll be tracking your time with a volunteer sign-in sheet such as this one. And any of these items can be tracked as volunteer time. So viewing webinars, attending workshops, doing surveys, doing your own weed pulls, hosting weed pulls, and any kind of restoration activities that you might do. So now I'm going to hand it over to Barb, and she's going to be speaking about invasive species identification.
So I am just going to talk about a few of the possible species that are in our area. There could be others that you find that are invasive species, but these are the main ones that we're concerned about because of it being adjacent to the Forest Service land. So we're also concerned about species moving upwards into the forest where it just burned, and especially so because they are doing a lot of work adjacent to our project area as part of the watershed project immediately adjacent to the city. So right now I'm up in the watershed area adjacent to the city. On that previous slide, I wanted to show you the size of the area. It goes from the right side of the photograph to the left side of the photograph, and it's about as far as you can see in the distance. This is one Dalmatian toadflax patch that's as big as a couple of houses. It's an amazing size patch that's out there in the forest already. So the next slide, thanks. Sheila's managing the slides, so. Dalmatian toadflax, most of you probably are already aware of what it looks like. It used to be in the Scrophulariaceae, now it's in the Plantaginaceae, a name change kind of thing. It's from southeastern Europe in what is now Croatia, and it used to be Dalmatia. It is a perennial plant with big flowers on it. You can see they're very pretty flowers. It was brought over primarily as an ornamental in people's gardens, and it is beautiful when it first starts flowering, and then it just gets sort of ugly after a bit. If it's not a managed plant, it becomes not too pretty to see, but it is fairly distinctive. And so it is a concern because it can cover massive areas in especially those areas that have a lot of disturbance. So after they do treatments and they do burn areas to burn up the debris from the fires, it comes in there, and because it gets increased nitrogen, it also gets very large, produces thousands of seeds. So this has always been a one of concern. It's been in our area since about 1940 was the first record by Deaver of Deaver Herbarium, and it was on the NAU campus. So it's been there since then. It's been at the Museum of Northern Arizona. It was first collected by Mary Russell Farrell Colton at the Colton Ranch in 1957. And the museum is part of our area of concern here. So it has been around a long time, probably not anywhere near as abundant as it is today. And so it is starting to take off. And this is true with a lot of invasive species. They come in very slowly. They get used to the environment. They find the habitats that work for them. And then after a while, they get into conditions that help them explode in their environment. So this is after greater than 50 years, this plant has adapted to the Flagstaff area and is now really taking off. Mm-hmm. As I said, this habitat can be disturbed. It's also around in the towns, in people's yards, occasionally on the streets, sidewalk areas and things like that. It is possible to pull the plants before they flower and just put them out on the ground. You can see at the right, they have rhizomes that connect between little plants. But if you pull very gently, you can get a lot of that, and that takes away a lot of nutrient for these plants. And I've found that if I go back on the same trail for, say, 5 years and pull consistently what I see, it really does diminish the populations a lot. So hand pulling does work. Herbicide can work too, but it's harder because it has waxy leaves, and it takes special kinds of herbicides to get through those waxy leaf types. So this is one that you could survey for and pull it at the same time. And actually, this is a good time of year to pull it because it's just beginning to flower. So you can pull and leave the plants there. Later on, if you pulled, you'd have to bag them and haul them out. Next. Scotch thistle is one that is coming in a lot around the museum area. Here's the plants when they're full grown first. Very large flower heads. The inset at the right shows the spines on it. Those are actually quite large spines and a nice pinkish color on the flowers. And the plants themselves can grow to be like 12 feet tall, and they can fill in beside each other so you can't even go through them. The big thing on them is the, I don't know if I can point at it, but the spines go down the stem so that you would never want to grab a hold of the stem of this plant. It's very formidable looking in that respect. This shows young plants coming up in a field where they had been eliminated the year before, supposedly, but because it's a disturbed area and the seeds can be persistent for like 15 years or more once they fruited. This we've gone back to every year and eliminated the plants before they fruit, and we still have young plants coming up. And these are very large. If you look at these, that one on the right's probably knee-high already, and it's starting to bolt. There's a flower in there that you can start to see. So they tend to be biennial, and which means the first year usually they don't flower, but they can. And then the second year you have a lot of flowers coming along. And Jan can talk about how we work with these, but this is just an example of how it comes in. Next one. This shows the leaves, and they're very spiny. They also are covered with some white hair, and it gives it a very whitish appearance. And these leaves are as big as your foot or bigger. If you have very big feet, they would be as big as your feet. So think of a thistle that has leaves of that size when you're looking at this. These are very big leaves. And that's a characteristic of the Scotch thistle. Very, very tall, very big leaves, and amazing stems with spines on them that you would never want to grab. Okay, so that's a common one in Schweitzer Valley and in Schultz Creek Valley. It could come in other places, and it's been along roadsides too. So one to keep out for. This is actually Big LaRue Spring out by Fort Valley, but I took a picture because this was an area where they restored the water to the drainage, and it's a very hopeful situation. And Steve Monroe here is a hydrologist, and he and I went out to inventory the quote native plants that were coming back in here, and I found all these little thistle plants coming in. Well, musk thistle is abundant in Fort Valley, and so it had already found its way into LaRue Springs. And musk thistle looks fairly similar to Scotch thistle, except if you look at the flowers and fruits, they're turning, and it's called nodding thistle because the flower head sort of gets very heavy and turns downward. And this also can get like 8 to 10 feet tall and doesn't tend to form as big clump as solid an area of clump infestation, but it certainly can form very big plants, especially in horse pastures where they get some extra fertilizer and places like that. So it is particularly nasty in Fort Valley, and there's some on museum grounds that are, and down in Schweitzer Valley and other places that are coming in. So this is another thistle from Eurasia to keep an eye out for. Next. Yellow star thistle. These photos happen to be taken at the Sedona water treatment plant, so that's why it's red brome in the background instead of cheatgrass. But these were flowering there, and they are mostly in the Verde Valley, but why I put them in here is they came up to the Wildcat treatment plant in Flagstaff in the late 1998 or so. We found them up here in Flagstaff, and it was the thing that spurred us on to developing a weed EIS for the Forest Service and to establishing the San Francisco Peaks Weed Management Area, was this plant right here. It's a very unpleasant plant, very spiny. If we had a close-up of the spines, you'd see they're very spiny. If you look off to the left of the little note, yellow star thistle, or up above it too, they're really there. And if horses eat this, they get what's called chewing disease, and they actually get their tongues swell and everything, and they can't eat, and they can starve to death. So it's a very, very bad plant in that regard. And a lot of these plants that we're talking about are either toxic in themselves or have allelopathic kind of chemicals in them that inhibit other plants from coming in. There's various things. That's why they're called noxious weeds, just because they are. Okay. Yellow star thistle is let's see, I can get there. Anyway, and then the next one we have is thistle, yellow star thistle. Diffuse oh no, this is the native thistle. Okay, I put this in here just because we have abundant Wheeler's thistle in the Flagstaff area. This is under the ponderosa pines, just a general nice undisturbed ponderosa pine area. And you can see the whole area there's little pop up things. Those are all heads of native thistles. The difference with this is you can see the seedling over there on the right, how tiny it is compared to the thistle head. And also the plants get maybe at the most knee high. They don't get over 1.5 feet tall or so. Last year was a very prolific year for this thistle, but it is not, you can walk through there. You don't have any problem walking through there. You can touch the plants. They don't have any spines on the stems. There's spines, a little bit of spines on the leaves. If you tried to grab hold of probably the flower head, you'd feel some spines, but it's just not the degree of spininess that the non-native thistles are. So there's several species of native thistles, and we prefer that nobody goes around and tries to kill the native thistles, and just leave them for the pollinators and the other animals to have in their normal native habitat. Next. Okay, now we do have another obnoxious weed. This is diffuse snapweed, and this has been a big focus of our surveys to find out where the distribution of this is. It's especially up on McMillan Mesa, and then down in East Flagstaff. It's very, very abundant. This is in the back side of your photo is the Route 66 plus Starbucks, the new Starbucks that they put in, and the road behind that, it goes up to the Catholic Church. So these basins were scraped all off. There used to be a vet there and various malls and things like that. And now they've come in with knapweed, and it's just full of knapweed. And knapweed turns into a tumbleweed. So that's one of its concerns too, is it breaks off and can blow in the wind, and some of the seeds stay stuck to the plants that are blowing around. So this is in the sunflower family too, just like the thistles were, but much smaller flower heads. And if you go to the next one, we have close-ups. This is how you can identify it, the one on the left. It's a very diffusely branched, sort of pretty little candelabra kind of plant, not very tall, probably about 1.5 feet tall. You look over on the right, you see the flower, the top one, the white flower, and the spines on the underneath it. It's not a very big flower at all, but it, like I said, it blows in the wind, it drops these seeds, and it just has, it's allelopathic, so it does inhibit other plants that come in around it. There are a lot of other small composites, this in the sunflower family, that can, for much of their life, look fairly similar to the species. So that's one reason we need good training on this species, because it's has a lot of lookalikes for the novice kind of person. Another plant is the spotted knapweed. If you look at that lower figure, it looks very similar to the diffuse knapweed. We don't have it, it's not near as common. The places I know it around Flagstaff are on the forest, and not in, so far I haven't really seen it in our project area, but you can see it has sort of spots on the phyllaries there, instead of the spines being the prominent thing. That has these dark spots, and that's why it's called spotted knapweed. Spotted knapweed is a real pest up in places like Montana and Eastern Oregon and those areas. So their big pest is spotted knapweed, ours is diffuse knapweed. And here's a third, another one called Russian knapweed. And Russian knapweed is actually in a different genus, but it is, has a different kind of a habit to it, in that it's connected by rhizomes under the ground. And so it perpetuates that way a lot more than it does by seed. We had a population out at the Snowball Road, and we treated it for 20 years about, and with herbicides, and these plants are still there. These are some that I just took a picture of last year. So there are a few of Russian knapweed still left out there. As you can see on the inset photo, its fruits look quite a bit different. It doesn't have any of those spines on the, well, it's probably the bud, but you can see on the bracts and stuff like that, no spines are evident. It's all sort of roundish and everything. Because the big thing with this one is spreading by the roots. That's the big way this gets around. And it's also allelopathic, and so, you know, inhibits plants that would grow underneath it. And this is my grass finding dog. She is out in the Schweitzer Meadow area, and this is Nikki. And you can see a pond in the background. And this actually has a fair amount of natural vegetation in it. The pond is all natural plants, native plants with it. And then coming forward, we have some shrubs, and then we have western wheatgrass and some squirrel tail. And then we get into some annual bromes, and then especially cheatgrass. But if you look in the distance, you can see red areas. And at a certain point, the cheatgrass turns red, and those red areas are solid, pretty much cheatgrass. So you can see one big area off to the right, center, well, further back than that even, and then off to the left, smaller ones. So there's a lot of cheatgrass in this whole valley. It goes from the Elks Club basically in patches up to the museum land, and there's just a lot of cheatgrass. So that's a big issue, and it's also starting to be a real big issue with ranchers. The other thing about cheatgrass is it inhibits other grasses. It cures out in June, and so it's a big fire danger species. Not only has it inhibited some of the native grasses, but then it'll burn, and it will have a return in frequency of about 4 to 5 years. So once you get solid cheatgrass stands, you have a big problem with fire. And it's moving up toward the forests and into the forest, mostly from the grassland. There's a close-up of it on the left a little bit. It's pretty distinctive once it's in fruit. And it pulls easy if you can get it before it goes to fruit. It actually does pull quite easily. Or as one person said, you could cut it off as long as you recognize what it is and not let it fruit. And that's a good way to do it because it is an annual. And if you do that for 2 or 3 years, you can eliminate your population too. And that is in a way better because you're not disturbing the soil so that you're creating more seed bed. And the seeds are persistent up to about 5 years or so in the soil. The grass at the right is jointed goat grass. And this is one I don't really like it a lot. It's because I never notice it until the seeds have already dropped off. And the seeds break apart, each separate little clump thing there along that you see, sort of a joint, that they break off and fall on the ground, and then it's like you need a vacuum cleaner or something to get them up. They're just there. So it was not very much present in the Flagstaff area for a long time. I noticed it in my yard probably 10 years ago. And now Jan tells me there's a lot at the museum. We're just getting a lot more of that jointed goat grass. Now this is foxtail barley, the sort of very light yellowish green color. And you can see it's coming in amongst the cheatgrass. So that's good. It is a native plant. It does have long awns on it. And so if you have animals, you have to be careful with that. In a natural area, you wouldn't want to cut them off because that's the seed that's going to seed in. It is a short-lived perennial. So it's better than the annual cheatgrass. And but it does have that feature. It flowers now and fruits now, starting fruiting out. The other one that looks very much like it is the squirrel tail, and it'll fruit out a little bit later. And it is more of a perennial. It's quite a stocky perennial. And so that's a good plant to have too. So coming in amongst all the cheatgrass, we do have a couple native plants that are beginning to come in. Okay, that's the grasses. The other plant I wanted to mention is poison hemlock. It is in our project area, I've heard. This picture happens to be taken at Picture Canyon. It's come in there in the restoration area alongside the banks. It likes sort of moister areas and ditches and those kind of places. It is poisonous, especially the seeds are really poisonous. when you control it, you want to wear gloves and long sleeve shirts and washing your hands before eating, etc. like that. It's in the umbel family, related to carrots and parsley, plants like that. You can see in the center photo, there's some spots on the stems, and that's a characteristic of the species. But this is one where there's quite a few look-alike kind of plants, and it would be desirable to really be able to tell them apart. Not that you would want to eat any of them, but out in the wild, but just this one is very poisonous, and there's some others that are quite poisonous too in this family. So this is one we'd like to keep out of towns and people's yards and places like that where they might have children that just decide that's something fun to have around. So I think that's the last slide.
Thank you, Barb. All right, I'm gonna switch gears right now and jump into talking about how to document invasive species with our survey project. So if you choose to help us participate in this surveying, we will help you by coordinating teams into specific neighborhoods, such as Schultz Pass or Sunnyside as an example. And then we're hoping to have a volunteer be that neighborhood lead for the area, who can then help organize the volunteers to do the surveys and to do any sort of hand pulling or treatment. So there are three really easy ways to do surveying. You can use paper maps, you can use your phone and take pictures, or you can download the free Gaia GPS app and track your information with tracks and waypoints in Gaia. Okay, so the first way is just with a paper map. If you're in a neighborhood, you can pull a map from Google Maps or whatever map app that you use. Just print it out. Try to print out a section that's easily identifiable with some landmarks so we know exactly where you were. And then just kind of, do some weed surveys and do some hand drawing of the route that you took. Maybe put some little points, kind of how I've demonstrated here, to kind of see where you may have encountered weeds. And then just a small little note at the bottom about which weeds you encountered, maybe how many you found. Maybe also record how long of a survey you did, so that we can get those hours tracked in the grant. The second easy way to do it is just to take a photograph. And so when you take a photograph with your camera, the location data is included in that photo file, which is really handy. So we can pull the GPS coordinates directly from the photograph. The way that we do that, though, is as long as when you're taking photos, that your location services are turned on the phone. Sometimes people don't want to be tracked, for privacy, so you might have turned your location services off. So for this project, we'd have you turn the location services back on again. And then this is just a couple quick instructions on how to do that with your phone. You can always call me too for tech support. I can walk you through many of these tech instructions. So this is just a picture of how I pull that information off of a photo, the picture of some diffuse knapweed up near Lake Mary Road. So really it's just a simple 1-2 click of the file info, and it pulls up a little map even, the location in decimal degrees, and it has everything, all the data listed there, so it's very handy. The third way to do some surveying for us would be to use the Gaia GPS app, which you can make tracks and you can also make waypoints. So this is something that we can go into with more detail in a future workshop. But also this is just kind of for your own information too. Gaia is just a really handy way to do hiking and track your favorite routes, etc. So after we have folks do some surveying, we would like them to send that data into me. You could have photographs of your hand-drawn maps. Like I said, that would be fine. Weed photos with a short description. And then the waypoints and the tracks can be exported from Maya. And that's my email address. And then now I'm going to hand it off to Jan. I'll be advancing the slides for you, Jan. And she will be discussing the invasive species removal techniques and site restoration.
Great, I guess I'm ready for the next slide. So pretty much the way that this grant was designed is with the hope that treatment below the fire area will prevent spread of the weeds into the burn area and drainage extending into the Rio de Flag watershed by wind walkers, vehicles, and animals. And so the first thing is that you can help when you're out. A lot of the avenues of spread from our urban weed populations up into the fire area will be by foot. So we have creatures like my dogs, have to get the dogs in every presentation, Zeta and Sirius, who can transport the weeds on their fur. Hikers who can transport the weeds on their feet. Water, well, it's mostly running down from the burn area. The weeds also grow within the areas and can blow up the drainages. And I think bicycles are another big one because people on bicycles have some really good mobility. So when you're out, you can help by both pulling weeds if you see them, by noting where they are, particularly when they're someplace near trailheads, either before you enter the forest or once you are in the forest, and giving those observations to Sheila. And if you have time, you can pull them when you're out, but if not, if you let us know, we'll begin to work that into the planning of the grant. So as Sheila said, the area of this weed grant is really large. It's about 5,200 acres total. And so we have an approach to it. The main financial component of the grant is to tend to treat populations of weeds that are at high risk of spreading. And the first tier of what we're treating are large areas of invasive plants in a monoculture. If anybody has been up to McMillan Mesa, is a fine example, you know, pretty much you've got diffuse knapweed as far as the eye can see. And this grant gives us some hope of beginning to tackle that and knock it down. So in these areas, we're going to have contracts out for commercial spray of 2-year chemical treatment, and then afterwards seed native grasses to put something in and help keep the weed infestation down. Smaller areas with mixed weeds and natives, we will have hand pull and hand herbicide crews followed by seeding, and in that instance we'll be using American Conservation Experience and Arizona Conservation Corps volunteers to accomplish some of that more selective work, and also volunteers. Invasive plant rangers training in the neighborhoods, and this can include work on private yards and utility rights of way, hand pulling and seeding, and we will have some seed available while supplies last, and potentially some plants that we can give people to put in once they remove some of the weeds to help keep them down. And then beyond controlling the weeds and seeding or planting natives, we need to make sure that our crews return periodically to check what's going on and retreat. So this is a pretty quick slide here. This shows what it looks like to be doing large area chemical treatment. And as we said, it's predominantly diffuse knapweed. Year 1, spray. Year 2, we spray again. And then after the spray has had a chance to kill off the knapweed, then you can seed with native grasses. The crew options, here are some pictures of some different crews. The upper picture is an American Conservation Experience ACE crew, and the lower is a University of Arkansas volunteer team out at the Arboretum. So these crews and our invasive plant rangers will have neighborhood weed pulls and then do follow-up monitoring and continued surveys. Invasive Plants Ranger training will be having neighborhood workshops 8th this year, just about every other Saturday to be determined. And if you can't attend the one in your neighborhood, you're certainly welcome to attend any of them. We're looking for each neighborhood for a neighborhood lead, and we have been gathering information both with personal contacts and at events for people who can be contacts for an area and kind of be a captain of the team and help organize it and get people motivated. And the training will equip everyone with skills to do neighborhood surveys and independent weed pulls. So Invasive Plants Ranger training will cover all kinds of great things. First, those who participate will get one of these amazing Invasive Plants Ranger Program Stop the Weeds stickers that you can put on your water bottle or your notebook. At each training, we'll specially target species to remove in your neighborhood, so it will vary from place to place. We'll go over native lookalikes so that we protect them, because it can be hard to sometimes tell the weeds from the good guys. We'll talk about the best tools for the job, best methods of control, how to prioritize species and activities with the species, how to dispose of weeds, and follow-up surveys and attempts for restoration. So one of the things that's really important that we'll cover in the trainings, but we'll just touch on here some of the things that we'll be talking about, will be how to identify your plants. And on the upper right, there are 3 pictures on the upper right: a seedling, a rosette, and then a mature plant in bloom. Those are all diffuse snapweed. So one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that we know what the plants look in all their different stages. The plant on the bottom is Dalmatian toadflax. And of course, we're all familiar with the pretty yellow flowers, and maybe after that, the little brown seed heads. Possibly know what the leaves look like when they're coming up from the ground before they bloom. But we'll also have other stages that are almost grass-like. Well, one of the things that we want to cover in the training is a really important thing. When we're pulling weeds, lots of times there are some really good native plants with them that we don't want to pull. We want to protect the natives and recognize and avoid lookalikes. So looking at this picture, what you can see on the left, on the top, is a bull thistle, which is an invasive that we would like to pull. And then next to it, our native Wheeler's thistle, which is very beneficial for pollinators. Barb showed that in an earlier slide, but you can see there the differences in the flowers. Next slide over to the right, or the next picture to the right, we see a young rosette of diffuse snapweed. It's very distinctive looking, but it's easy to confuse with a lot of plants. And so the plant just to its right is actually a wild chrysanthemum. Later on, another life stage of the plant for diffuse snapweed, you can see the very open, airy plant covered with all kinds of small white flowers. And just to the right of that is a close-up of how to recognize diffuse snapweed. The phyllaries, or the things that hold the flower together at the bottom, have all of those nasty spines coming out of them. And if you go to the right, you'll see a plant that can look very much alike, which is a Brachylia. And yet if you look, it has very smooth phyllaries, none of those nasty spines coming out. So that's one of the things we'll do in the training, is really work on being able to do plant identification throughout all of the stages. In the bottom left, we have all different pictures on the left of Dalmatian toadflax. And it's pretty easy to recognize when it has the big kind of blue-green leaves on it, or the flower. But when we get down to the young seedlings in the bottom row, that's a whole bunch of very young Dalmatian toadflax seedlings, and they look a whole lot like the stalks and leaves of blue flax to the right there. And so that's blue flax in flower, but when you get, it looks nothing like toad flax, but when you get down to it, young toad flax and young blue flax, they look real similar. And one of the ways you can tell those apart is actually even the texture and the feel of the plant. To the right then, we have, on the bottom, we have cheatgrass or downy brome, and that is very hairy. One of the things you can see with that plant is it's real easy to pull up. It's an annual and it will offer you no resistance as you go to pull it out of the soil. We do have a whole lot of native bromes, most of them perennial, that are quite similar in appearance, usually not quite as spiny, and most of them with a big, healthy underground root system at the base. So if you go to tug on those, it would be really hard to pull one of those out of the ground as easily as you can. So those are just some of the lookalikes. And so that's one of the things we'll work on in the training, is making sure that you know the difference. Another thing is proper tools and equipment. We all have our own favorites, but some of the things we'll cover is the personal protective equipment to wear, what kind of tools to have, a sharp shovel, something that has a flat edge on the top of the shovel, so when you push with your foot, you're not just cutting through your shoes with your shovel edge. A hori, a lot of people like that as a tool. A geology pick or rock hammer, which is the one with the blue handle that works really well with getting entire root systems out, particularly in rocky, hard soils. And frequently loppers or hand pruners. Next one. Trainings will also consider what methods to use. And so the different methods we'll look at are to remove the entire plant, which could be done sometimes when you're lucky by just pulling, or frequently by digging. Soil solarization, and you'll see the picture in the upper right-hand corner, shows a huge patch of Scotch thistle on the Museum of Northern Arizona's land. And at this place, SOT actually covered all of the plants with this clear plastic and got the edges sealed down so heat would build up underneath it. And we found out that it was a really successful way of killing a huge patch of young Scotch thistle that otherwise we would have been digging at for hours. Sheet mulch is real similar to that, and on the bottom left you can see for stands of things like cheatgrass, where you just have a gazillion of them and it would take you your whole life to pull them, and nothing really that you want to save in the patch. You can put down cardboard, put mulch on top of that, and then over time that will just choke out the cheatgrass and you can plant right through that or seed something else on top of it. And then frequently as a last result, when you come upon something to the right, like this Scotch thistle, you can see it's in flower and it's even starting to go into seed. Say you don't have a lot of time and you don't want those seeds to spread, you can clip off your seed heads or remove the top of the plants, and sometimes with annuals it will set them back so that they don't bloom anymore at all, they just die, or sometimes at least it will buy you some time to come back and treat the plant. Another thing, quality control. When we're doing the project, we just want to make sure that you're familiar with the root system of the plants that you have so that you can know that you are getting the entire root system. The cheatgrass on the bottom left, you can see once again has this teeny little root system, very, very easy to pull. The next plant, I'm not even sure which one it is, but it has a big taproot going down, and so unless you get that entire taproot, the plant is likely to come back. And then the two plants to the right, which are diffuse knapweed and Dalmatian toadflax, you can see how they're all connected to one another. So all of the separate tops are connected by this long rhizomatous root system. And so frequently you find yourself having to get rid of all of those and the attachments between them to actually get rid of the plant. And then when you're done, you usually want to make sure that you firm the soil and can put in some native seed if you have any. So those are the sort of things that we would like to cover in the weed training for the best results, and we would love your help. The next step for helping would be we're going to have a series of trainings. So if you can attend a training, that will be a great step. If you're interested, we are looking for neighborhood leaders who have strong skills in terms of plant recognition and like to organize and help their neighborhood get the projects together. You can report infestations in the way that Sheila told you earlier. Pull weeds and organize your friends and neighbors, or work with the homeowners association. When you're out and about, you can look for weeds at trailheads, right-of-ways, your home, or your organization, church or school, or whatever it is you're affiliated with. And we can also use help caring for the seed field and help growing native plants at the Museum of Northern Arizona, so that we can make these seeds available and plants available for use in putting something back in after weeds are pulled. So thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for your help and interest. Here's more information, and this is the end of our presentation.